I recently was doing a deep dive into slavery for Black History Month, and some of the things I found is just crazy. I know they said that they brought over all these slaves during the Mid-Atlantic slave trade, over 300,000 slaves brought here, but what I found out, that just simply wasn't true. What I want y'all to do is to look at this video with an open mind, realizing that maybe it was that we were already here, and that the African Americans are the true Native Americans.
TikTok is only for entertainment purposes and educational purposes only. Do your own research and use your own discernment. Anything you take from this video is at your own risk. With that being said, so I'm on slavevoyages.org, right? Just doing some more research type shit. And have y'all actually looked at the records? No, like actually looked, because I decided to go deep, right? Because I wanted to know exactly how many enslaved Africans they brought directly from Africa into the Americas. Look what this shit says. All right, so boom, this is the slavevoyages.org website, right? So I filtered the place of vessel departure because I want to know exactly how many enslaved Africans, once again, was being imported from other ports outside of America into the Americas. So these are all the ports outside of America where they was capturing these slaves, right? And then I filtered the place where the vessel voyages ended. So this is where they ended up at after coming from outside of America from those different ports that I showed you last time. So I filtered to mainland North America and Spanish mainland America, which is the Americas, right? So according to slavevoyages.org, from the years 1700 all the way up to the 1800s, they didn't even have documentation from before that. They only recorded about 7,005 enslaved people coming from outside of the Americas into the Americas. And if you look at the summary, the stats, right? Once again, captives embarked from outside of the Americas total captives were 7,005 enslaved people, right? Captives disembarked when they got to the Americas was actually 6,091, so it's actually less than that. Now, mind you, from the 1700s all the way up to the 1800s, they only recorded about 29 voyages being made. Mind you, again, these were coming from all the ports outside of America into the Americas, right? So just keep following you. So I decided to take a step further, right? Because I want to see how many African enslaved people was coming just directly from the African ports, not other ports, but just the African ports. It is worse than I even thought. All right, so once again, I filtered the place of vessel departure, once again, just to reflect the African ports. And I filtered the place where the vessel voyage ended just to the Americas, and I've included South America as well. And look what this shit says. Captives embarked, meaning coming outside of the Americas, 414. Captives disembarked, coming into the Americas, only 408 enslaved people was recorded coming into the Americas, just from Africa, from the African imports. And if you look at the table, let's look at the table. And they only recorded one trip, guys, from 1803. That's it. They only recorded one trip coming into the Americas of the African slaves only coming from the African imports. One freaking trip. Oh, but wait, let me show you something even more eye-opening. If you look at the intra-American slave trade, which is the domestic slave trade, it says captives embarked 742,000, captives disembarked about 700,000, and they made about 37,000 voyages within the Americas, from different ports within the Americas. Pay attention. So from the 1500 all the way down to the 1800, and once again, this is for the inter-American slave trade, guys, the domestic slave trade, they only recorded 109 Africans being moved within the Americas. But when you look at Brazil, they recorded 196,000. The Caribbean, they recorded 213,000. Mainland North America, they recorded 137,000. Spanish mainland America, they recorded 180,000. And a total of 742,000 enslaved people being moved and traded within the Americas. These ships weren't arriving from Africa. The only ships that were arriving from Africa was in this column, and they only recorded 109 captives coming from Africa. The rest were already in America. Yeah, so the vast majority of these enslaved people were Black indigenous. They were born here, not imported, were prisoners of war, and were being reclassified in census records and legal documents and being traded via the intra-American slave trade, not the transatlantic routes. Because if only about 7,000 captives were being recorded coming into the Americas over the course of a century, and only about 109 captives were being recorded coming directly from African ports, then where are the 12.5 million Africans they said that they brought over here? And this is not a conspiracy, guys. This is coming directly from the slavevoyages.org website, from their own data. Yeah, they didn't import millions. You know what they did? They recycled, renamed, and reclassified the Black indigenous population that was already here, took those same numbers to build up an illusion of a mass African importation for their website. Because history tells us there was 37,000 voyages being made via the transatlantic slave trade, right? But when you actually look at the data and go into the records, those 37,000 voyages were actually made via the domestic slave trade. You see how if you don't pay attention, they'll fool you? From slavevoyages.org, it says, this database compiles information about more than 36,000 voyages that forcibly transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic between 1514 and 1866. But when you actually go into the records, those 37,000 voyages was coming from the intra-American slave trade, other known as the domestic slave trade. And the only trip being made from the transatlantic slave trades was from 1803. 1803. The rest came from the inter-American slave trade, starting from the 1500s all the way down to the 1800s, guys. Once again, according to Google, an estimate suggests over 36,000 voyages transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries, with the Slave Voyages Database a key resource documenting around 36,000 voyages. What a joke. All right, so let's do some basic math here. If only about 7,000 Africans were imported over the course of 100 years, then there's no way that our so-called African ancestors that they said that we are descendants from birthed the 40 million so-called Black Americans from the 1800s up into today. And before y'all get up here and say that they didn't record everything from the transatlantic slave trade, that excuse falls apart the moment you realize that these voyages were insurance-backed, tax-audited, and backed by whole nations and banks. And if they forgot to record millions, then they would have forgotten to collect the money, right? And if those were actually true African arrivals, then why does the transatlantic side only show 29 voyages being made over the course of 100 years, but the intra-American, the domestic slave trade, show about 37,000 voyages being made within the Americas? Why is there no physical, numeric, or archival evidence of a mass African importation, but there's overwhelming evidence of a system of internal indigenous enslavement within the Americas between the 1600s and the 1800s being disguised as African ancestry? That's not an African import story. That's a mass internal trade of indigenous people being reclassified to African after the fact. As a matter of fact, somebody put me to a different database where I can look into because they're playing enough.
As she said, I did my own research. Here's some pictures of what the first indigenous people to America would look like, or what they would have called Native Americans. It's funny, they have a similar resemblance to African Americans, don't they? And just as a fun fact, I even found out back in the slave days, they even had black slave owners. There wasn't many, but there was two notable ones, one in Louisiana and one in South Carolina. I suggest everybody do their own research. I'm not here to convince you that we didn't come here from Africa on a slave ship, but it's just something to think about. Let me know what y'all think in the comments, and let me know if it deserves a part 2.